star date, today's date, is actually the 8th. Yesterday was the 7th, and I did not work yesterday. I had the day off. I do work later today. But before I go in, I'm gonna make a little video for y'all. But, personal log. Yeah, so last year, I think I was working, and I said, oh, didn't you notice? It's December 7th, and my coworkers were like, what are you talking about? And I did my FDR impression. I went, today, December 7th, a day which will live in infamy. And they were like, huh? And that was most everybody. And I found that discouraging. Made me sad. Yeah, December 7th is Pearl Harbor Day. But that's not today. Today is December 8th. That was yesterday. Just talking about some things going on with me. Let's see. I'm gonna take a sip of this cup of coffee I just brewed. Good stuff. Yeah. My roommates have these animals, targs, and they don't get along, and they fight, and they quarrel, and sometimes when I'm recording, so I'm a little apprehensive about this, because at any moment, I can just hear a happen in the background, and it just cuts in on whatever I'm saying, and I just gotta roll with it, so keep in mind, that might happen. Other than that, I got a couple articles that I would like to read, and in order to do so, I'm going to go to the Purple Room. But that's the end of my personal log. Let's begin with this. I'm gonna play the theme music for the day. Yeah, let's go. Alright, let's go to the Purple Room. And we got two articles. I turned my phone off. I gotta turn my phone back on because I don't have the classic newspaper. I did signed up for like a promotional thing for the Wall Street Journal, and I have the electronic so I can read the articles off my phone. But I do like having the proper newspaper just to shuffle with it and all that. And when I'm done with that, I just leave it out in the living room, all that. Or I bring it to work. My work used to have the journal, and then they canceled it. Let's see. Going to the Purple Room, Purple Room. So, the topics of the day. Article second. We will start with The Guardian, an article by Fiona Harvey. And the title is, Greta Thunberg says school strikes have achieved nothing. Activists say 4% greenhouse gas emissions rise since 2015 shows action is insufficient. Well, yeah, but what you're doing isn't really action, and we'll demonstrate why. Well, it's a sort of action, I suppose. But you know what? I'm gonna do some Star Trek Online stuff before I get to that. This is my buddy here. This guy. Oh, I guess I already did it. Well, easy for me. So I'm just gonna stroll around the room here. What makes a place a promenade? I feel like I want to call this stroll around the promenade. I don't know if this is really a promenade. It's just a big purple construct. The big purple crystal. I'm wearing purple. Yeah. Okay. The global wave of school strikes for the climate over the past years has, quote, achieved nothing because greenhouse gas emissions have continued to rise, Greta Thunberg told journalists at UN climate talks in Madrid. Thousands of young people were expected to gather at the UN climate conference in the streets of the Spanish capital on Friday to protest against the lack of progress in tackling climate emergency, as officials from more than 190 countries wrangled over the niceties of wording in documents related to the Paris Accord. In the 4 years since the landmark agreement was signed, greenhouse gas emissions have risen by 4%, and the talks this year are not expected to produce new commitments on carbon from the world's biggest emitters. Thunberg, whose solo protest in Sweden in 2017 has since snowballed into a global movement, spoke at a press conference before a march through the center of Madrid. She said that although school children have been striking around the world, this, quote, has not translated into real action from governments. Quote, I'm just an activist, and we need more activists, she said. Some people are afraid to change. They try so desperately to silence us. So yeah, I'll finish the article, but yeah, some people are desperate to change. So desperate, in fact, that they won't adjust their lifestyle and their consumerism and those kinds of things. Instead, they demand that people in power do something. Power, power, power. We need people in power to do everything. And, you know, that probably is an element in the equation, but there are other things. Leading by example, for instance. And you kind of do that when you go out and you protest and you say this is what we need to do, but also making consumer choices and trying to convince people at a grassroots level. I know that's going to be really hard. Some might say impossible. So then the default response to that just seems to be like, well, what we need is the coercive power of government to make people do what we think they ought to. And oftentimes that conflicts with your other goals, what I assume would be your other goals. I think this is a post or something that I had mentioned earlier. A lot of people are like very like anti-corporate, and they're just like, well, these corporations, and it's like, well, when you're doing this like climate change sort of things, a lot of it involves like handing over exclusive government contracts for energy and stuff like that from one corporation to, guess what, another corporation. And so the people in power that we're talking about are often corporations, and we're going to let these corporations determine the direction of our moral lives because we just can't do it ourselves. We're just activists. Whoa, whoa, woe is us. To continue, Thunberg expressed hope that the UN negotiations, but doubted whether governments had got the message. I'm sure they got the message. And warned the world could not afford continued inaction. I sincerely hope the COP25 will reach something concrete and increase awareness among people, and that world leaders and people in power grasp the urgency of the climate crisis, because right now it does not seem that they are. Although young people would keep striking, Thunberg said, they wanted to stop if governments made credible promises and showed a willingness to act. Quote, we cannot go on like this. It is not sustainable that children skip school, and we don't want to continue. We would love some action from people in power. People are suffering and dying today. We can't wait any longer. So people are suffering and dying today. And in the future, I'm sure if we follow the lead, there will be no more dying and no more suffering. There's something about these very emotional like crusades where it's like, yes, we will cure the human condition, and a lot of times when you try to do that, you just end up curing humans of their existence. Like you kind of foist things on them that aren't really natural because you have assumptions about what people are, and there's just different kinds of people and some things that are maybe innate to their nature, and you don't like it, and well, you know, tough. So you're gonna have to work around those things. That's why the gist of it is I don't like this workaround where it's like people can't make choices collectively that will make the environment better, and we're gonna showcase that through like school projects or how we live our lives. Like, I mean, recycling goes so far, but just like, how do you commute? How do you get from place to place? And how do you do this thing and that thing? And what kind of products do you use, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But of course, it's all out of our hands because we are radically disenfranchised by power structures. Yeah. Hold on, I'm gonna mute my mic. I still have a little bit of a cold. Yeah, I understand people being discouraged because certain things, it feels like powerful people have a handle on it, and there's only so much you can do, and that we just need more activists. And I go, well, yeah, but I think activism should be able to take different. Um, it can look different ways. I think I've already demonstrated some of my skepticism of this movement, but I'm not entirely skeptical of the whole thing. It's just I don't like when the children lead and then they say things about power, and I go, yeah, but this kind of like falls into the line of some other things that are happening right now, and it makes me nervous because I think your voice is being hijacked by some unscrupulous, resentful people. Anyway, to continue. As well as the march and the sit-down protest in the conference center, there were shows of international solidarity among young people from around the world, including a picnic in central Madrid Park. The conference center was flooded with hundreds of school children accompanied by their parents, many with babies in prams, who were kept separate from the rooms where negotiators were working on a draft text to clarify aspects of the Paris Agreement. I don't know what a pram is. I guess it's like a little baby carriage. Young people voiced their frustration at protests inside and outside the conference center on the outskirts of Madrid. Somebody from Samoa speaking for the Pacific Climate Warriors, trademark, told the conference, "World leaders need to know that people like me are watching them. The text we put down today on paper at COP is what our future will look like." Many of the young people joining the conference from developing nations around the world bore personal witness to suffering they had experienced or seen. I'm going to cut in and say something else. I think people have this expectation that change and influence comes from power and the government, and they drastically overestimate both the competence and abilities to execute on a lot of these things. So that's part of why they're always talking about, like, well, we need people in power in the government, and the government needs to do things because, you know, that's how they think that things get done. For example, the text we put down today at the COP is what our future will look like. No. It's probably just a bunch of bureaucrats. I don't know exactly what's going on with all of this, but it's a bunch of bureaucrats making statements that go around certain feelings that people have about it. And some of it will be legally binding, and other parts, you know, whatever. But to continue. Quote, "I've had typhoid. I've had malaria. My grandmother died of cholera. I know what I'm talking about," said Jimmy, Caribbean person, national coordinator of the Caribbean Youth Environmental Network in Haiti. "We need to raise awareness among young people. We can get them to work together and send a strong message." Rene Baptiste, also from CYEN, said, "For us, climate change is no longer a concept or theory. It's our new reality. It's affecting our lives now." The activist Miguel van der Velden said, "These things are not games. They're getting worse. They're affecting millions of people around the world. I come here because I have hope that we can work together." And that's the end of the article. So that was a short one. I saw something else recently. It really doesn't have much to do with this article, but there were some names. Sometimes I have to read names in these articles, and I want to give like a shot at them, but there's a lot of people that do videos, and if they see a name that they don't feel they can confidently pronounce, they just gloss past it. And I know this upsets some people, but it's also something where I don't feel like you can win. Like I would take a stab at it, but in the attempt, you've sometimes butchered people's names. And oh, that was cool. I forgot I could do this. Back to Star Trek talk. Watch this. I can do a dive roll. What is that? What is that? It's a trap. And then it's gonna explode. That's a new ability I got. And I forgot that I had it. So yeah, every now and then, just to forewarn you, things will explode. But yeah, this person was talking about, I think he pulled up an article, and the article, I can't remember what publication it was from. It was no matter how I talk about it, it just sounds vulgar. But that's kind of like the point of it. Like, it was a picture of an ethnic-looking person, and I don't know exactly where they were from, but they had a somewhat exotic name, and the whole thing was like, you should know how to pronounce my name, and if you don't, it's act of aggression against me. And I went, like, okay, I get what you're talking about, but there's certain lingual norms that we have. Again, this is another thing where it's like against the norms. Like, how dare you have norms and things that you're comfortable saying versus things that might not be part of your experience. And if they're not part of your experience, it's not like, oh, I could learn and you know, all of that, or we can just, you know, agree to you know, get along. If somebody couldn't pronounce my names or said it, like if I was talking to like a Mexican or Spanish speaking person and they pronounced my name, there's different versions of it, like John and Ivan, and Jake and Jacob, and I met a person from Sudan whose name was Yagub, which is basically like Jacob. It was Y-A-G-O-U-B, Yagub. I mean, that's not terribly hard to pronounce, but like if he couldn't pronounce my name, it's not like I'd be like upset with him. But then again, everything's about power dynamics, and assumably I'm a more powerful person than he is. Like, that's not the way that I view the world. That's the way that these people would view the world, with like, you know, we you know, people in power. I don't. I'm kind of rambling off here, so I'm going to go back to this Wall Street Journal article. This one was from a couple weeks ago. This one is called "There's No Safe Space for Ideas on Campus. Animal farms in quotes. Zealous students, activists find ways to punish those who make them think uncomfortable thoughts." By Daniel Payne. This is from the 25th in the Wall Street Journal. Most Americans know that higher education has for several decades been in the grip of a deeply intolerant, fanatical, and uncompromising strain of progressive activism. Oh, this is an op-ed, if it hasn't become obvious, and also, I feel like there are a lot of people that would just look at the framing of the beginning of this article and say, no. But I think in practice, that's basically what it is. You accuse people of doing microaggressions and this thing and that thing and just communicating the way that they communicate, and instead of trying to understand what they're saying, you just insist that they are a villain and insist that they communicate the way that you want them to communicate. But you can't possibly be the one that is oppressing them or being aggressive, because you are a good person and an activist and they are a bad person. So even framing something like that is just a non-starter for most of these feelings, hippie gumbo people. But to continue, students and sometimes even, oh, it's refreshing. Hold on. Students and sometimes even faculty members regularly chase heterodox speakers off campus, demand complete fealty from terrified campus bureaucracies, and denounce and destroy each other over the slightest and most inconsequential ideological deviations. The environment isn't unlike George Orwell's Animal Farm, a place where no one dared to speak his mind, where fierce growling dogs roamed everywhere, and when you had to watch your comrades torn to pieces after confessing to shocking crimes. Yet an even more intolerant brand of campus activism is taking shape. This rising political philosophy isn't merely allergic to dissenting ideas, but is opposed even to ideas about dissenting ideas. It's a bit like the concept of metacognition in reverse. These activists, gripped by zealotry and inflexible dogmatism, are taking pains to avoid even thinking about thoughts with which they disagree. Yes. Consider a recent controversy at Washington College in Maryland. Students there successfully lobbied to shut down a campus production of a play just one day before it was set to open. The aggrieved students were upset that the play Larry Shu's, quote, The Foreigner, depicts the evil antics of the Ku Klux Klan. The play doesn't show Klan members in a sympathetic light. On the contrary, they're villains of the piece, and they get their comeuppance in the end. It's spelled comeuppance, C-O-M-E-U-P-P-A-N-C-E. That's not a word that I see in text often. I thought it was like comeuppance or something. I don't know. Comeuppance. Yet students were deeply upset by the Klan costumes the actors would wear, so the play had to go. The theater department was unable to find a satisfactory compromise with the student activists, a campus official dryly noted. A lot of this seems, I don't know a lot about theater, but a lot of this seems very throwbacky, like back to like Elizabethan England and stuff, where like if you wanted to portray certain things, you had to be very tactful and tasteful, and careful. I don't know. We'll continue. Several professors have also landed in hot water recently simply for speaking an offensive word while students were around. At Emory University, law professor Peter Zweier is facing major sanctions from his school because, in a few instances, he said the N-word. Mr. Zweier didn't direct the word at anyone or anything. He merely mentioned it, first as part of a discussion of case law and then to illustrate a larger point during a private conversation. Students claimed Mr. Zweier threatened their safety and emotional well-being. Another student who heard Mr. Zweier use the word was reportedly visibly shaken after the experience, as if he had suffered a near-death experience. Faculty wanted Mr. Zweier barred from school events lest they be forced to sit near him and risk their own reputations. Yes, be contaminated by the presence of the Voldemort. He said Voldemort. Like, I feel like kids like read the young adult fiction like Harry Potter, and it has messages about these things, and then it's completely lost on them. Like, I feel like that was something that was in Harry Potter, where it was like, everybody's just so afraid, and let's not be able to talk about anything, and let's just live in terror of this tyrant, and he gets all of his power from our fear of him and all of this, and then they just, like, there was that part where they shut the school, like, the school becomes, like, extremely rigid, and, like, nobody's allowed to explore anything or talk about anything, and there was that lady that becomes the headmaster, and it's like, I'm sure a lot of these kids have probably read those books, and then they go and act it out and demand it of their professors and the institutions of power. But yeah, so the whole thing about like the N-word, we're not allowed to say the N-word. There were a lot of executives in the past, man, time's flying. I guess it was a year or maybe 2 years ago now, at Netflix and Papa John's, where people, within the context of having a conversation about race and all of this, they said the N-word instead of N-word. And were maneuvered against out of their companies. And I feel like that is just a brazen power game right there that has nothing to do with the principle. It's just, oh, he did the bad thing, let's make our power play, because the only real thing is power. I had conversations with some progressive people, and they said, yes, this is entirely appropriate. And I'm like, okay, Voldemort, you are losers. An employee at the University of North Texas lost her job after referring to the N-word as an example of constitutionally protected speech. Students demanded her firing, claiming that her use of the word proved she was racist. Yes, so it's not understand what people are talking about, like, there's so many different caveats and rules for this, where it's like, there was that thing with Kendrick Lamar, I think. He was on stage, and then he had this white girl come up on stage, and she was singing his song, and the lyrics involved the N-word, and it was like a little trap that he set, and then she went through that lyric, and he went, whoa, hold up, and just like humiliated this person, and everybody laughed at her, and I go, you know what, I kind of detest the whole thing that you're doing. It's so ridiculous. But yeah, what you're doing is inferring motives. She said the word. I'm not going to listen to what she actually said. What I'm going to do is just infer motives and call her racist. And this is a point that I've made in previous videos. There's cognitive behavioral therapy. And in cognitive behavioral therapy, they identify cognitive distortions. That's a technical term. And cognitive distortions is when you basically put motives on other people, and you project nonsense, and they're basically ways of thinking that are irrational and counterproductive. And I feel like this social justice movement uses those cognitive distortions as a bludgeon against other people. And at the same time, often in different areas, will claim like, you know, academic and scientific credibility. But like as far as the psychology goes, what you're doing is not psychologically healthy. And it's not good for you because you are deceiving yourself, and it's not good for other people because you are bullying them with your nonsense. But to continue with the article, actually, yeah, I gotta get another cup of coffee too, so I'm gonna take a break after this. At Augsburg University in Minneapolis, a professor uttered the word while discussing a James Baldwin text that itself used the word. That professor was suspended after a student outcry. A professor at the University of Kansas got booted off the tenure track after referring to the word during a class session. When I was in 3rd grade, I remember, maybe even earlier than that, we were studying American slavery and stuff, and I think we got some kind of little disclaimer, like, you might be uncomfortable at these things in these languages, but they didn't really make us so terrified that we were unable to have a discussion about it at all, other than, I mean, it's not like we had a lot of informed opinions back then, so they just kind of took us through the curriculum, but I don't think I'm the worse off for it. I was able to hear the word spoken. Like, there's something condescending about having to hear N-word and F-word and this word and that word. It's kind of childish. To continue. One Michigan state, more evidence of ideological intransigence can be found in the bias response teams that are now regular features at many universities. Yes, I read these collegiate articles, they mention bias response teams and bias incidents. It's really slimy. One Michigan State student had a bias report filed against him for watching a Ben Shapiro video in a dorm. A faculty member at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln was reported for having a Trump sticker in his office window. Another professor was hit with a bias report after discussing the infamous Janet Jackson Nipplegate controversy. The offended student said the professor had not couched this discussion with enough moral qualifiers. Or disavowals. Like, oh my god, people just can't talk. These incidents don't represent the normal campus hysterics to which we've become accustomed. A growing and strident sect of campus activism is coming to oppose not merely differing opinions, but even talking about differing opinions. That's super Soviet style. This is a new and far more uncompromising brand of progressive politics, where even an unsympathetic and progressive depiction of the Ku Klux Klan is just too much to handle. Yes, because they are trained to infer motives on you and not actually understand humor and satire. All they're trained to do is just infer motives and bully and power. Administrators are partly to blame. University leaders have been far too quick in recent years to yield ground to political zealots, with the result that zealots feel that they more or less run the show on campus. They aren't wrong. But the real responsibility for this mess belongs to the student activists. Oh, but I thought an activist was a good thing. Nobody forced them to become hyper-partisan fanatics. They did that on their own, and they now find themselves enmeshed in a Got it. Okay, that took me a second. Yeah, that died. My controller died. So I'm going to read the last paragraph. But the real responsibility for this mess belongs to student activists. Nobody forced them to become hyper-partisan fanatics. They did that on their own, and they now find themselves enmeshed in a silly, thought-free ideology, the consequences of which will surely come crashing down one day soon. Yeah, I feel like the scary thing about this is you can't really persuade them out of it. They're so inside of it, and this is kind of the gist of the article. Like, if you are opposing me, if you're opposing what I'm saying, if you are even showing disagreement, I'm not going to qualitatively look at what's wrong with your argument. I'm just going to say, oh, well, you only would disagree with me because you're a bad person. And they are being reinforced in this thought by people in positions of power. And a lot of these collegian articles I read talk about, like, you know, we need this person to represent these interests on this board, just because if we don't have somebody that's sitting on this board, then we're not represented. And I think a lot of these people are interlopers with an ideology that is not helpful. So that's a problem. But yeah, I found this article interesting. At the bottom, there's a video of protesters at the Harvard-Yale football game. What was that, on the 23rd? It looks like my controller is not charging as fast as